All right, this screencast is going to get into the federal bureaucracy, and it is a very important part of our government to understand. So let's start with our enduring understanding. The federal bureaucracy is a powerful institution implementing federal policies with sometimes questionable accountability. This is actually last year's version. They took this part out. But the key word here is implementation. They implement federal policies. So Congress passes the law, and then an agency typically is there to implement the law. So we have explain how the bureaucracy carries out the responsibilities of the federal government, and we have tasks performed by departments, agencies, commissions, and government corporations are represented by writing and enforcing regulations. That's a big one. Issuing fines, so they also have some sort of compliance mechanism. Testifying before Congress, and we'll talk about oversight here in a minute with regard to what that means. And then issue networks and iron triangle, something that we discussed in class, but it's good to review. In the past, there was a lot of what we call patronage, which these types of jobs are good jobs, they're high-paying jobs, they're secure jobs, and they were given out to friends of politicians. And, of course, that can lead to bad outcomes. So there were some reforms. The Pendleton Act required merit-based hiring and testing and things like that. So you can't work for the FBI, for example, unless you pass a rigorous exam. And the employees of the bureaucracy collectively are known as the civil service. And the merit system is a key part of that, where you're supposed to have people in these positions that are qualified, because they are really the ones behind the scenes creating the specific rules and policies that the people have to follow. And then this ties into this idea that when you have qualified people, they act professionally and they have areas of specialization, and they remain politically neutral. And as you might imagine, that doesn't always occur. And we'll talk about that more in a second. Explain how the federal bureaucracy uses delegated discretionary authority. Now, the word discretion means they get to choose. So they can choose how the laws should be carried out, for example, for their rules and how they're going to be implemented. Discretionary should be discretionary authority and rulemaking authority to implement policy are given to bureaucratic agencies and commissions such as, and we have this list of them, and this is just a small list of the cabinet departments: Homeland Security, Transportation, Veterans Administration, Education. The EPA is a cabinet level agency, even though they are not part of the cabinet technically. And then you have all these other regulatory groups like the FEC, the SEC, stuff like that. And then another concept that ties in here is called oversight. And a lot of students really struggle with this idea of oversight. Congress has the power to fund or defund these agencies. They typically create the agencies and give them kind of like a charter of what they're supposed to be doing. When the agencies are out of line, that's when you have oversight. And oversight, it's important to remember, is reactionary. This is not like the confirmation role with regard to the Senate in confirming the president's choices. This is reactionary. And you may recall in class we talked a lot about the Boeing fiasco back when people actually flew, and how two horrifying plane crashes occurred with brand new airplanes because there was a major design flaw in regarding this engine placement, and it tended to tip the nose of the plane up. And the big issue was, how did this get certified to fly? And the answer is the FAA was coordinating with Boeing directly, and in fact deferring some of the certification process to Boeing. And you think, how could that possibly happen? And for that, you need to understand the iron triangle. All of that to say, once this global pandemic situation passes, there almost certainly will be hearings on what happened with regard to Boeing, so that the same kinds of things will never happen again, because in the modern era, airplanes don't just fall out of the sky for no reason, especially brand new ones. So the tools of oversight are hearings, where they get together people and put them under oath and make them answer a bunch of uncomfortable questions, and the power of the purse, where they can defund the agencies if they're not behaving properly. And then, as a means to curtail the use of presidential power, congressional oversight serves as a check of executive authorization and appropriation. Don't forget, the entire federal bureaucracy serves at the pleasure of the president to implement, as the president's power to execute the laws. And even though Congress oftentimes creates these bureaucratic agencies, they serve at the pleasure of the president. The leadership is appointed by the president, and generally they're supposed to follow what the president wants as he is commander-in-chief. So let's take a look at some of the practice questions. And again, you won't be doing multiple choice questions on the exam, but it's a good way to review the concepts. Which of the following is likely to occur as a result of new legislation regarding automobile safety? So we have A, the Supreme Court will be asked to review the legislation annually. States will be empowered to begin automobile manufacturing. The Department of Transportation will be given discretionary authority to create auto regulations. Mandatory spending will be required at all future federal budgeting for the program. So C is clearly the answer. Department of Transportation would be given discretion to write the regulations. So again, Congress passes the big picture idea. We need to make cars safer. The details fall on the agency or department. Okay, next, the new president has been elected and has a number of positions to fill within the federal bureaucracy. Which of the following is an example of filling a position based on political patronage? Choosing a Secretary of State to appease members from the opposite party, nominating a high-level campaign fundraiser to serve as an ambassador to New Zealand. Now that may strike you as a little bit odd, but that actually is the correct answer because the person was a campaign fundraiser. They worked on the campaign, and what do they get in return? You get to be ambassador to New Zealand, which is a pretty cool place to visit, I understand. Anyway, so it's a little perk of helping them get elected. So reappointing the Secretary of Defense, even though he or she was appointed by the previous president, who's a member of the opposite party, asking the chair. So I've already revealed the answer, but all the rest of these are distractors. Go to the next one. Which of the following scenarios best illustrates a formal check on the power of the bureaucracy? So a formal check is something that one of the other branches would be involved in. So a lobbyist representing the NRA refusing to meet with employees. Secretary of Defense being called to testify before a congressional committee. Well, that one sounds pretty good. The White House Chief of Staff being formally censured by the president. The Chief of Staff is not part of the bureaucracy, so that's not the answer. A federal judge being impeached, and again, a judge is not a part of the bureaucracy. So B is our correct answer. And don't forget, Secretary of fill in the blank is all part of the bureaucracy. Okay, next up, explain how the president ensures that executive branch agencies and departments carry out their responsibilities in concert with the goals of the administration. And this is where it gets a little dicey, and this is where new incoming presidents often learn the hard way, as certainly President Trump did, that you really are not doing your vision for the country any favor if you just let people that have served in the previous administration, especially the opposite party, stay there because they probably have a different ideology. So the president, typically when a new administration comes in of the opposite party, they fire everybody in the cabinet and hire new people that are more aligned with their way of thinking. And there's nothing wrong with this. It's just the way of the world in our country. And even though these people may be qualified, there's one thing to remember, that the bureaucratic leadership consists of people who are appointed, and they are not necessarily chosen based on qualifications. It's the people underneath that are. So a good example of this is Ben Carson, who was appointed by President Trump to be the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. And those of you that don't know, Ben Carson was a internationally famous pediatric neurosurgeon. And you may wonder, what does that have to do with housing and urban development, which is all about policies to help people obtain mortgages if they're low income or whatever else they do? The answer is nothing, but it's kind of a little bit of an example of how there is still some patronage happening, even though the people working in HUD would be financial experts, experts in the mortgage industry, experts in issues involving people that don't have enough money to qualify, and on and on and on. So just remember that little detail. Compliance monitoring can pose a challenge to policy implementation. So again, it falls on the bureaucracy to make sure the laws are actually being followed. Explain the extent to which governmental branches can hold the bureaucracy accountable given the competing interests of Congress, the presidents, and the federal courts. And then here we have Formal and informal powers of Congress, the president, and the courts over the bureaucracy are used to maintain its accountability. And so just real quickly, the formal powers of Congress, the power of the purse, the power to control the budget. In other words, the president he has the power of appointment, which requires Senate approval, but it does not require Senate approval for the president to remove somebody. So the president can fire people all the time if he wants, if he doesn't like what they're doing within those agencies. And of course, the courts are there anytime there's a dispute where maybe there's a constitutional question or something like that. So I'm going to go to review topic 12 to kind of review this stuff, because I think this is, if there's anything in these review topics that resolves some confusion, I think this is a really good one regarding the bureaucracy. In recent years, there's been numerous questions on the AP exam. You can read this on your own, but basically this is a favorite topic in the past. So here's it is. Only Congress has the raw power to pass legislation. The president enacts it with his signature. But Congress lacks the expertise and time to implement the laws they pass. Therefore, when a new law is passed, a new policy is made, it is the job of Congress to create, empower, and fund. So typically, now some agencies are made by executive order by the president, such was the case with the EPA, but typically it's Congress. And notice the three things they do. They create the agencies, they empower the agencies, and they fund them to carry out the law. So I often use the analogy of a shipbuilder, a shipbuilding company that, goes and takes all the time and effort to build an ocean-going ship, and eventually the thing gets done. And when they dump it in the water and it sets off to sea, it's really kind of an island on its own. And so these agencies, once they're created, they have a great deal of discretion. They have a great deal of authority, much like that ship would out on the open seas, not necessarily dependent upon the creator anymore of the ship. So kind of a goofy analogy, but maybe that helps you. Okay, this is an example that I like to use, and it's something that I don't know, we need to go through the whole thing, but Congress passed the Clean Air Act. Well, what's the objective of the Clean Air Act? Well, how about to clean the air? Congress can't do that by themselves, so what do? Nixon, maybe a little bit ironically, created the EPA. And the EPA, their job is to make sure that these standards under the Clean Air Act are met. So the EPA was created by an executive order. Congress later authorized it and funded it. And their whole mission is to create and enforce environmental policies. So every time you go to get your car inspected and they measure your emissions coming out of the tailpipe of your car, that is the EPA doing its thing. And the states, under our system of federalism, do their part by requiring those emissions tests to comply with EPA directives, and that's kind of how it works. Now, I don't know that we need to get into all of the details of the bureaucracy, but topic 13 is a good one to look at, and I'm just going to kind of quickly go through the high points. There's 4 types of agencies: the cabinet, which are all the big ones, people chosen by the president, confirmed by the Senate, so Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury. These are the umbrella organizations where there's hundreds and hundreds of sub-agencies that fall underneath them. Independent regulatory agencies. Now, the word independent is very important, because if your job is to regulate and the president, let's say, doesn't like what you're doing, for example, the Federal Elections Commission, if they weren't independent and the president was able to say, no, you can't do this or that, well, what's the purpose of the agency? So the whole point of the agency is to make sure people aren't cheating in our election system, improper candidate donations, things like that. So that's why the independent regulatory agencies. And then there's independent executive agencies, and again, I wouldn't waste too much time worrying about this, but the EPA and NASA are kind of our go-to examples where they are still independent. They still have their own mission, but a little bit more of a tie into the executive branch. And then we have government corporations like the Post Office, Amtrak, Tennessee Valley Authority would be another one, Corporation for Public Broadcasting. And initially, these government corporations were thought to be filling a void where maybe it wasn't profitable, or it just wasn't reasonable for the private sector to get involved with those things. So these are government subsidized corporations that fall within the bureaucracy. In fact, the largest initial element of the federal bureaucracy, even before the military was what it is today, was the post office. Of course, today, the military, by far, in fact, the military commands more of the discretionary budget than the entirety of the rest of the federal bureaucracy. So the military is the largest bureaucratic agency by far. And I'm just going to hop over here real quick to topic 21, which is on the budget, which is actually probably a good one to review too. You can see that the national budgetary situation is just unimaginably horrifying. We have roughly a $4 trillion annual budget. At least we used to. It's probably way more than that now with all the spending we're doing. But anyway, we have this orange part of the pie is what we call discretionary spending. That's the amount that the government actually gets to choose to spend, because the rest is already committed with regard to Social Security spending, interest on the debt, and things like that. So this is already committed. This part right here, the discretionary portion, is what they actually get to spend. And of that, look at this, a whopping 54% in 2015 anyway goes to the military. And this is under Obama. So it's even larger under Trump, which means that the entire federal bureaucracy has only half of the discretionary budget. That's everything that government does, and the military is an increasing proportion of that. If I had to guess, I would say it's probably 60% today, which is just unimaginable. So anyway, just want to throw that in there. Okay, and then just real quickly, what powers does the president have? They have the appointment powers. They can do executive orders. And then Congress has oversight. They have power of the purse. They have the possibility of legislative action, so they can vote to deregulate an industry. This happened very dramatically in the 1980s, back in my day, with the telephone industry. You guys have never really known, most likely, what a landline is, or paying long distance charges or things like that. But all of the cell phone competition that we have today was made possible by deregulation. Back in the old days, it was not practical to have people running physical lines everywhere all over the country, so it was a regulated monopoly. Okay, finally, iron triangles. Now, this is a topic that a lot of people are confused by. It's really quite simple. A lot of these agencies are involved in really mundane types of things, and they work in very specialized industries. So the example that I'll use, so this is from the FDA.gov website, the Food and Drug Administration. And this is the list of, I just Googled food additives, just to show you how mundane and boring this could be. And they have an agency directed to all of these different types of additives. So anti-caking agents, antioxidants, emulsifiers, herbicides, nutrients, solvents, on and on and on. And all of these details about that. So this is some really just, mind-numbingly boring stuff. And you think, who does all this stuff? Well, the answer is it's the FDA. And the FDA is going to work with an interest group like this one here. This is Grimway Farms, which, according to the Open Secrets website, was the top contributor to agribusiness spending. And you can see here they have, we work with a variety of certifying agencies to ensure our products and processes meet all regulated standards. So where are these regulations coming from? They're coming from the FDA. So going back to the iron triangle, this is our basic model. You have a congressional committee, you have a regulatory agency, and you have an interest group. And they all work together, and they end up making policies. And some of these policies are kind of mundane, as we said. Who cares about food additives? Well, if you're in the growing business, you do. And if you're the government and your job is to make sure the food is safe, you better have some relationship. And these interest groups have a relationship with the governing agency. And of course, they're funded and empowered by Congress. So, why would a growing group give money to a political candidate? Well, because they may sit on a committee that funds the agency that oversees them. And so you have this kind of little incestuous relationship. Actually, probably not the right word. I call it symbiotic. They all kind of depend on each other. They're mutually dependent. And generally, the outcome is positive. And of course, things can go wrong when you talk about things like Boeing. And that iron triangle was really a policy failure because it certified planes that should never have been certified. So the iron triangle is kind of a double-edged sword. The thing to remember about it is, going back to the outline, just remember that iron triangles generally concern areas of policymaking that are largely outside of public view. And so the original outline talked about questionable accountability. When you have these policies that are made without input from the public, you really have to sometimes question, where are the people in regards to that, and do these agencies actually have too much power? All right, so that does it for this one.